Chart update, 9th September data. No deaths, so we'll shut you down. UK Covid deaths averaging 10 a day versus 1,600 normal deaths, so don't expect deaths to get a mention when they justify shutting society down. Note to censors, we use only government data. If you have a problem with the results, speak to the government. In the world rankings, Peru has overtaken Belgium as the #1 worst hit nation in the world, and Spain has overtaken the UK as the second Western nation. The US has overtaken Sweden into #5 for Western agenda nations and #11 after 4 South American nations and Italy. I have no idea what is going on in South America to push them to rival the agenda nations. They are the only nominal non-agenda region to do so. We have a few new measures on the right, measuring the length of the contagion and the distortion, rate to come down versus rate climbing. It's actually more prevalent than I'd have imagined, so a slight caveat on calling fraud too eagerly. It doesn't change that we have plenty of reason to consider the UK experience fraudulent, even above the obvious measure of being one of the worst hit and outspoken agenda nations. Nevertheless, as a chart, we're seeing the massive push for testing reflected in cases, giving the government the excuse to lock down, and while deaths have dropped to minuscule amounts, check out the oscillation, to me an indicator of a random number generator. Who knows what the real numbers are? But the government has successfully drawn out the situation and the oscillations get wilder. Sorry, I don't buy that. New York City, and again the Cuomo virus is reluctant to let go. It's managed 93 death days when 40% of the world's countries are under 1 day, 80% are under 7 days. That ain't natural. From the 29th August data, a dramatic demonstration of the bizarre experience of the agenda nations in South America versus the rest of the world. Same virus, same reporting? I don't think so. This was the chart from 17th August with standard mortality indicated by the blue dots. Even New York City only managed around 50% of real life, but for most of the world, COVID has been a trivial distraction in deaths, if not government reaction. Round the world, starting with Africa and Algeria, a long-standing and persistent niggle, not a factor versus normal everyday mortality, but not going away. Probably a hint as to the reality for the future for all of us. South Africa, and after an early contagion that looked rational, it's climbed in a straight, exponential manner till finally curling over. Not quite trivial, but not a material threat. Would like a quiet word to see how real that climb is. Zambia, meanwhile, shows what the heart of Africa, poor, vulnerable to disease, thinks of the virus. Deaths are so sporadic that the red dotted daily deaths is gappy, 0.3% of normal mortality. We should be so lucky. Americas and Barbados, not a fan of their quarantine measures, but hard to argue with 0 deaths showing up after their first mini outbreak. Brazil, and here's weird. #9 in the world, we really should do Peru, and look at the frantic oscillators in the bottom indicators, and a daily death that just goes literally horizontal, zigging away at peak. That's real. Canada, and nice to see it down at trivial levels, but the push for cases is apparent. No doubt the government will be using that to be loyal to the agenda. If there's one lesson of COVID, we need a new style of government. Ecuador, #8 in the world, still a bit sporadic in its reporting, and with that massively horizontal deaths at a not significant, not trivial level, and a what the spike to boot. Eyes on the ground needed to make sense of that. Mexico, #13 behind Sweden, and again that long horizontal at peak. Wild oscillator in the indicators at bottom. Not in the least normal, but I'd like to understand why these non-agenda nations are playing silly buggers. USA number 11 with the same oscillators and horizontal deaths. Second swell, hardly critical levels of deaths, but it ain't dying either. I guess the narrative is too compelling. Austria, a rational EU core nation, 15 days cases to death lag, proper collapse of the contagion, and deaths sporadic now, though pushing case discovery with testing. Be curious to find out whether agenda fear or celebration is winning. Belgium, and look out, second bump. Never mind. Quite funny actually. Ever get the feeling that someone's heart just wasn't in it? Croatia, now you see him, now you don't in deaths, 1% overall mortality. You don't have to be in the Far East to brush this off, but it no doubt helps. Denmark, and please tell me they're celebrating, with deaths barely appearing since June. Pushing for cases though, not exactly an optimistic sign. Finland, and not a trace of deaths since early June, which means a lot of 0 death days, which kills the smooth average data point. Looking at bottom left, there might be the occasional death, but that's nicely over. But yet again, a massive push for cases. France had a sporadic time, but gone solid again at very low level. Massive push for cases, climbing linearly, exponential here on log scales. Don't want to think what that means for the poor French populace. Germany trickling along, not too keen on those enthusiastic spike days for deaths, even at such trivial levels. Let it die. Their push for cases moderating, it seems. It's not a factor in deaths, but politically, I guess you'd have to watch the German news. The Greek government announced on Monday that tourism business employers impacted by the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic will still be able in August and September to suspend employee contracts in an attempt to cushion the financial blow. How do I feel about that? I don't know. They do have a recent climb, but at extremely low levels. You want that to shut down the tourism industry when you've done so well. That's a lot of hardship for minimal cause. Not happy. Hungary, the prancing pony in deaths right now, mostly invisible and then a pop-up. Massive push for cases. I do hope they're not taking it out on the people. At 1.3% of overall mortality, they should be celebrating such a non-event. Iceland, a masterclass in getting it out of the way, but it helps if you're a small island. Ireland, a strong EU agenda player, but done with it. Massive testing apparently, sporadic deaths. So what's it to be? Celebrate or under the agenda's thumb? Locals will know, I guess. Italy, and this is looking familiar. Massive push for cases, trivial deaths, though they had an uptick in the last few days. I know what the UK is doing with cases. Is every agenda country to suffer the same fate? Malta, and like Iceland, sorted with almost no deaths. Unlike Iceland, it has had a few recently. At 0.7% overall mortality, hardly a crisis. And they have their testing enthusiasm as well. Is no one to escape? Netherlands, and dropped to 0, massive push for cases, and had a second bump. Already patchy, hardly a second wave. Second ripple? Norway, and again, deaths disappeared, but the push for cases is notable. Remarkable how consistent everyone is about following orders. Not reassuring. Poland ticking along at a minor level, 1.1% of overall mortality. Ratio of cases to deaths seems consistent, so no push for testing apparently. Hopefully a country living with another virus to add to the repertoire. Portugal, like Poland, ticking over at a minor level, 3% of overall mortality, deaths gently declining, cases pushing up, suggesting a testing initiative. Caveat agenda government. Let's hope not. Again ticking along a little higher at around 90 deaths per day per 100 million out of 2464. A tiny fraction of the causes of death in Russia. No absurd surge in testing, adapting hopefully to one more cause of death. Come back to an agenda player Spain, and what do we see? Second wavelet, a large gap between cases and deaths suggesting a push for cases, and a downtick, so maybe the second wave is already fading. Sweden, the critical player. Without Sweden, we'd have had no recognised counterpart to the agenda. I'm still not totally okay with the chart, but at least it's now down to sporadic deaths and no lockdown penalty. Switzerland, one of the responsible players loyal to the agenda, but also loyal to its citizens. Looks like a strong testing push, but deaths are sporadic. Let's hope the government is aligned with the people, unlike that of the UK. Turkey and a hint of a second swell, already curling over at modest levels. No apparent surge in testing, cases climbing while deaths falling, and insignificant overall mortality. Lucky them. Australia, and a rare case of the second wave actually exceeding the first. Love to dive into that, so to speak, but no apparent testing surge with cases collapsing and deaths likely to follow suit. Not a material level, yet the agenda rules in terms of lockdown. China, which is really Hubei, and nothing since March when Hubei was over. Some testing perhaps in August, 0.1% overall mortality. They were first, and Ferguson and Johnson ignored them like they ignored Korea and the rest. Indonesia, and an unusual chart, climbing ever so slowly, but 6 months later still not at material levels. Overall mortality 0.6%. Not exactly a threat, is it? Japan, and an interesting chart with a legitimate second bump to minuscule levels already curled over. Whatever they did, it was highly effective. Whatever the UK did was also highly effective at maximising deaths and fear. Korea, the first non-China country to be done with the virus and at absurdly low levels. Sporadic deaths since then, a little burp recently. No lockdown. Did the UK learn from them? Apparently not. Malaysia, and what a delightful chart. Deaths ended at the beginning of May and have only sporadically occurred since then. 0.1% overall mortality. Strange how the Far East can do so consistently well, and the West so consistently badly. New Zealand, reminiscent of Barbados for its complete absence of deaths, apart from a few at the very beginning. Yet the government has apparently taken every opportunity to eradicate freedom and democracy from the nation. Philippines, like Indonesia, a long drawn-out climb to minor levels. Overall mortality 0.6%. Singapore, the slide to show people who try to excuse New York City's results because it's a crowded city. 27 deaths in a city of 5.7 million people, call that 40 deaths in New York versus New York City's reported total of 19,000. Thailand, and like New Zealand and Barbados, a few deaths at the beginning and then zip. Literally none as seen on the bottom indicator, red hump. After the first contagion, cases fall away to a trickle. I do hope the nation is celebrating. Vietnam, and after recording 0 deaths in their first outbreak, they had one and cancelled it. Now they've recorded a few deaths, 35 in total. Overall mortality 0.0%, which means less than 0.05%. A long way from the US politically and in distance. Back to near Asia and the Mediterranean, and India continues its long and gentle climb, with a correspondingly gentle curl-over at very modest levels. Overall mortality 1%. Iran and it's ticking along at modest levels, not sure why, but not a material threat. Iraq had its first successful and modest outbreak, but has gone on to a more significant outbreak, but still at very modest levels. Again, the strange sustained daily deaths, but at perhaps 5%, 120 out of 2464, of ordinary mortality. Israel, another double humper, Bactrian, Dromedy, at very modest levels. Interesting how a lot seem to be around 100 deaths per day, normalized, not a threat. Pakistan, and delighted to see its long primary contagion descending to oblivion, 0.6% overall mortality. UAE, and seems to have some testing going on, but deaths are sporadic, good to see. Since they are at number 1, number 6 and number 7, let's take a peek at Peru, Chile and Bolivia. Peru has that strange let's get to peak and just keep it there in deaths. Really? Or just a convenient fiction? Locals may know. Chile not identical, and after a first normal-looking contagion, it had a surge to a massive hit, now trailing away absurdly slowly. Again real? Who knows? Bolivia seems to be following the climb to peak and hold, but cases are coming down, which makes the spike in reported deaths a bit bizarre. I lack the local knowledge to have a sense of real versus fraud. Overall, where are we? No one has been threatened by a second wave. A second bump, second wavelet, second ripple have made their appearance, but none to threaten significance versus ordinary mortality. That hasn't stopped the UK pushing testing to support a tyranny, and it is literally a tyranny right now, with deaths minuscule but shut down to 6-person groups and local lockdowns. Who doubts that the agenda nations, including Australia and New Zealand, will go for mandatory vaccines to protect the public? Hancock has apparently proposed a £100 billion programme of testing to save Christmas, to grant an early Christmas to pharma and medical equipment companies more like. This remains the biggest criminal fraud in history worldwide and in the UK, with the traditional dictatorships ironically missing out. Now it's democracy's turn. That's it for now. I'm Andrew Mather, 6-year-old Brit, mathematician, financier, technologist, husband, biker, pilot, healer, whatever. Feel free to get in touch, andrew@peerlessreads.com or andrew@amather.com. Either should get to me.